And now we'll proceed to panel discussion 4, how the US-China rivalry and sanctions on Russia are affecting and reshaping the world economic order. There are 4 panelists in this session, respectively, from New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, and Canada. And now please welcome our moderator, Senior Deputy Director, Taiwan WTO and RTA Center, Chung-Hua Institute for Economic Research, Republic of China, Taiwan, Roy Chun.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and it's been my pleasure to serve as a moderator for this panel 4. Before we start, I would like to, if I can, abuse a little bit on the privilege as the moderator of this session. I would like to add a kind of subheading to the theme or the topic of this panel. The subheading goes as national or economic security debate, how the US-China rivalry and sanctions on Russia are affecting and reshaping the world economic order. The reason I was trying to add a subheading into the topic of this session is actually to reflect the importance of the topics that we are going to discuss for this panel. It fits in perfectly with the general topic of this year's凯達格蘭Forum, that is the Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue. Security at this moment, or at the present day, is no longer just a military or political concept. It involves extensively economic discussions and economic debates on how economic security can be enhanced in the process of policy formulation. And many of the formulation and discussion of the economic security issues is already reshaping the global economic order. For example, at the height of Taiwan's economic relationship with China, over 90% of Taiwan's ICT or information technology product companies delivered their overseas contract in China. The year is 2016, but if you look at the data in the year 2020, the ratio of companies still assemble their products in China reduced to just 79%. So for those companies, the world is definitely being reshaped because of these new rationales. Now, in the last 40 years, we have already witnessed a global economic system or even a global supply chain that builds upon economic rationales, cost saving, efficiency, the availability of resources, and the availability of workforce, for example. The objectives in the last 40 years is simple: optimizing production efficiency, minimizing economic costs. But that structure we are also witness a significant shift of policy rationales and commercial rationales against the existing or the global economic order that we understand in the last 40 years. Before the pandemic, for example, we are already witnessing a large number of debates or policy discussions or directions towards enhancing the level of economic security. All these common terms of supply chain resilience, diversification, reshoring, or present nowadays even more popular term of friendshoring are all part of the policy tools that have been discussed or maybe even utilized to achieve the objective of a better level of economic security. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Russia invasion into Ukraine, definitely, to my view, not plays a critical factor not to reverse the process, rather they accelerate the process of economic security and other rationales being bring into the picture of policy formulations across many governments. The U.S.-China rivalry definitely is a starting point, but the rivalry or the strategic competition are not limited just to U.S.-China. European Union is also considering a similar set of approaches in reshaping or readjusting the current economic structure. Japan has just passed a legislation to promote economic security enhancement just last month. And many other countries are also pursuing this new, let me put it this way, more balanced economic order. So the sub-thing of this panel 4 is how the U.S.-China rivalry and the sanctions on Russia are affecting and reshaping the world economic order. And today with us, we have 4 distinguished panelists joining us to share their experiences and also enlighten us on their recommendations on how each country are affected by this new economic order and making recommendations on how commercially, politically, militarily we can adjust to this new economic order. And Taiwan is definitely one of the beneficiaries of the global supply chain, and we also see great opportunities as well as challenges because of the world economic order, and we welcome all the panelists today to share with us their recommendation for Taiwan into the future as well. So let me briefly introduce our 4 distinguished panelists for this panel 4. The first speaker will be Mr. Charles FINNY. Charles FINNY is an old friend to Taiwan, and he is now serving as the chairman of the New Zealand-Taiwan Business Council, New Zealand. And before that, he is the director of the New Zealand Commercial and Trade Mission in Taipei, and he has been working closely even with this凯達格蘭forum in the last couple of years, and we welcome you, Mr. FINNY. And also, our second speaker is Dr. or Professor SAHASHI Ryo. Professor SAHASHI is now the Associate Professor of the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia, University of Tokyo, Japan. And before Professor SAHASHI moved to the University of Tokyo, he has been working in various capacities, including think tanks in Japan as well as other universities. And we would like to also welcome Professor SAHASHI to join this panel. And the third speaker is Dr. Samir PURI, who is now the Senior Fellow of the Hybrid Warfare and Urban Security at IISS-Asia, Singapore. And before moving to Singapore, Dr. PURI has been the assistant head of one of the, maybe I would like Professor Dr. PURI to introduce himself, but working with the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom. Our fourth speaker is Professor Meredith LILLY, and she will be joining us via a pre-recorded video link. And Dr. LILLY is the Associate Professor and the Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy, the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University, Canada. For each of the panelists, I would like to invite you to limit your initial presentation within 10 minutes, so to allow us to have a discussion with the floor and between each other. So without further ado, let me give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Charles FINNY. Charles, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the introductory comments, which I agree with very, very strongly indeed. To some extent, you've repeated my comments there as the moderator. In New Zealand, we begin these discussions by a few words in our local language. So, kia ora tātou, which essentially means da jahau, as you all know. So, good afternoon. I hope everyone's well, and I'm very sorry I can't be in Taipei to be delivering these words. Here in New Zealand, the world is slowly returning to normal after COVID, and we're traveling now very freely around the world. the COVID numbers are terrible, but we're living with it. So certainly the international supply chain we were familiar with in as recently as the very end of 2019 and early 2020 is not what it was. COVID really disrupted things for the first year and a half. And more recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had major implications for the international system and global economy. No one got it right when predicting the impact of COVID, which is encouraging because no one is actually going to get it right, or not many know exactly what the full implications are going to be. So my predictions are made in the full knowledge that I'll probably be wrong, but I'll probably be joined by many others. But as we saw at the start of the COVID outbreak, many were predicting a contraction in global demand. But for traded goods, what we saw actually was a growth in demand, and the severely disrupted aviation sector and the global shipping networks could not meet the demand over the 2 years since the outbreak of COVID. And we still remain in catch-up mode and probably will be well into next year. And continuing COVID outbreaks in major economies such as China are adding to that chaos. More shipping capacity is coming on stream. Aviation is slowly returning to normal. But as I say, I just cannot see the current disrupted state ending any time before perhaps early to mid 2024. Responses have been very interesting. The moderator referred to the just-in-time model. Certainly, that's been severely challenged, and there's been an obvious trend in parts of the world to onshoring. I'm most worried about sort of macroeconomic conditions. The printing of lots of money in many economies has had the predictable impact, inflation. Central banks were perhaps too slow to wake up to the risk, and we are experiencing now very high inflation. This is forcing a resolute response in terms of interest rates from central banks. The rises have been so steep in some economies and so quick that some are predicting the possibility of a high inflation recession combination. We used to call that stagflation. Many policymakers have not experienced this before. Unfortunately, those like myself were very familiar with this in our early careers. We know how dangerous the situation can be. COVID came to us at the end of the Trump administration. And as we all know, Trump ran a highly protectionist trade policy, which saw many of the United States trading partners retaliating. There was a risk that when COVID emerged, we'd see more protectionism. Fortunately, this didn't happen. But unfortunately, President Trump's policy prescription appears to have outlived his presidency and seriously infected the Republican Party. The party of free trade is not what it used to be, and this has major implications for US policy under President Biden. A protectionist Republican Party and the left of the Democrat Party mean that a majority in favor of trade liberalization is just not possible at present in Washington. Maybe things will change a bit after the midterm elections, but I'm not hopeful. So against that backdrop, Russia's invasion of Ukraine could not have come at a worse time. And so, aside from it being an inexcusable breach of international law and a humanitarian tragedy, it has added more disruption to the supply chain. This has been particularly severe in the grain market. There is perhaps some good news in prospect there, though recent attacks on Odessa haven't filled me with confidence. But the sanctions imposed on Russia and those that Russia has imposed itself have had major negative global implications. Energy prices are likely to remain high for some time, and this will complicate the challenges facing central banks in their efforts to cool inflation. It seemed that Russia was calculating that the US and Europe were in economic and political disarray, that democracies were in crisis, and that a strong unified response to Russian actions was unlikely. It is possible that the Chinese leadership encouraged him in this view, as it seemed that at the time they shared it. Putin also seemed to be assuming that Ukraine would not be that difficult a country to invade militarily. He was wrong on both counts. Rather than add to a political fracturing of the Western democracies, he's actually achieved a unity at a level that has not been apparent since the Cold War. NATO is set to expand with Finland and Sweden, radically changing the political and military policies for those two countries. And if you look at Japan and Germany, I see major changes. The legacy of World War II has been rapidly put behind them, and we have new political and military positions being adopted. I think historians will probably see 2022 as a pivotal year in global politics. And militarily, Ukraine's resolve has demonstrated what asymmetric strategies can achieve and how unwise it is to try and invade a society that wants to protect its identity, its democratic institutions, its free media, and its independent judiciary. It's too early to predict where this war will end up, but the Russian economy, which, as we know, is roughly about the same size as Taiwan's, must be under very severe strain right now, and the cost of the war, economic sanctions will be slowly having a very major effect. There are lessons for others as well. It seems clear that the response to Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014 and those that argued for appeasement were wrong. We weren't strong enough in our response as the West. And it's worryingly similar to the experience from the 1930s, unfortunately. I suspect that there will be more resolute response should other major powers try to emulate Russia's actions. China, I'm sure, is learning many lessons, and it's interesting that the support that was apparent for Putin early on in the invasion has become much more muted. I think many of the assumptions Beijing has been working under the last few years are being reevaluated. But I think China will be seeing opportunities, particularly in Russia, and I'm not quite sure the Russians have fully thought through the implications of what might happen if China steps in to help out economically. Long term, we could see China becoming a very much more major player in the Russian economy. My own country is rethinking its posture. We're a very vulnerable small state. If a large state wanted to bully us, it reminds us how important it is to have good friendships and alliances. And I'm sure that we will be rethinking our defence strategy and level of defence expenditure. The United States response has not been confined to the imposition of sanctions and the provision of defence equipment, training and intelligence to Ukraine. We can see increased activity in the Indo-Pacific with the Quad rising in importance. The response to China's policies in the Solomon Islands is an example, and also the response to Wang Yi's recent travel in the Pacific has been very rapid and very much notable. President Trump's policies left something of a vacuum in the region, and it's really pleasing to see that the Biden administration is seeking to fill this fast. This is probably easier to do in the military space than economic. China is now firmly entrenched in the regional economic architecture. It's got an extensive FTA network in the region. It's a member of RCEP and has applied to join CPTPP. The United States, unfortunately, is not able to engage in this way. But we're watching with great interest as the US is developing the concept called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There's much more detail, obviously, to be worked out. But to date, we've got at least 13 Indo-Pacific jurisdictions keen to join the initiative. Unfortunately, Taiwan is not included in the framework at this point in time, but it is pleasing to see that the United States has a bilateral initiative with Taiwan, which actually appears to be going beyond the framework. Hopefully, this will assist with Taiwan's application to join CPTPP, and I would also hope lead eventually one day to a bilateral FTA with the United States once this becomes possible. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum.
Thank you very much, Charles. I have already an instant question for you, but maybe we can come back later. I have a question on how New Zealand, as a very small but vibrant economy, is reacting to this new global economic order, and what can be done collectively in addition to CPTPP and other efforts for countries to minimize the uncertainties associated with this new, still unfolding economic order that we are witnessing at this moment. But probably we'll come back to that later. I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor SAHASHI Ryo from the University of Tokyo, to take the floor. Professor SAHASHI.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to this凱達格蘭forum again. This is my privilege to speak in front of you, even over camera. So, yes, I think I generally agree with Mr. FINNY's statement and presentations on the state of world economy. It was a really good summary of analysis and concerns on what happened now. And I think what I have to do in coming 10 minutes is to share my own Japanese perspective on the order, economic order and security order in transformation in Indo-Pacific. But I think today you already have 4 speakers from Japan, many politicians. I believe they shared our perspective a lot. So I try to make some difference from them because I can't expect what they say. So I could be a little bit cynical, but you know, just don't take me wrong so much. So the first thing I want to say is Kishida administration, Fumio Kishida, our Prime Minister, he was really quick to responding to Russia's aggression to Ukraine. It was very, very surprising to me because he was so quick to respond and try to make a coalition with other advanced nations like G7 members to have very strong sanctions against Putin and Russia. And also he denied very strongly the possibility of negotiation with Russia. It was a good surprise for me and for many people in Japan. But why? Because I think he sensed a very big shift of international order after Russia's aggression to Ukraine. This is the first thing. But the second thing is, you know, many people in Japan change a sense of security after Russia's aggression. This is very important. Like Taiwan, and like my friends in Taiwan, many people here start to feel, are we really okay with this, aggression, right? So Kishida wanted to respond to such a shift of perception on the state of the world, And this month he had last month on June he had a campaign for upper house. Normally, he had to concentrate on domestic agenda, right? From March to June, that's a very important political season. But what he really did is to focus more on foreign policy and international diplomacy. He even visited NATO summit during the 2-week campaign season. So it is a good evidence, the Japanese government really want to respond to this crisis with full commitment. And somehow, fortunately, Japan will host G7 summit next year. This is very important. Maybe for Kishida, disarmament might be very top agenda, one of the top agenda. But I also sense 3 things will come up for next G7. First is food security. And second is energy security. And both of them are, of course, the results are from Russia's aggression and also Russia's behavior against Ukraine, even including Ukrainian crops, right? So I think it's a very important moment for Japan diplomacy to show our commitment to such a big problem like food and energy. And the third thing, this is still uncertain, is Japanese government might want to take a lead to human rights program next year summit. Because not only Russia, but also China showed the big, very serious aggression or abuse of human rights in many parts of the world. Sometimes helping the dictators and others by their own technology. So I think human rights might be also the third top agenda for the next G7. But anyway, so this is a very important moment for Japanese government and Kishida administration. And I believe, they will keep such a high commitment to international order. 5 minutes past, so let me go into the second point. But having said that, I have some frustration on Biden administration. On the first things, Biden administration is too much inward looking. Of course, they suddenly presented the ideas IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework from last fall. But what is IPEF? Do they really give up the idea to come back to TPP? Yes, maybe. But the IPEF can replace the TPP? Of course not. IPEF can be a really good path to FTAP? Of course not, right? I mean, IPEF has nothing inside. But still, of course, we know the problem of American domestic politics very well. They don't have any TPA, so they cannot do anything. But the real problem is, even in the beginning of IPEF process, American idea was very underdeveloped. And with the support from Japan and other regional countries, they finally enlarged the list of member countries who joined the negotiation of IPEF. They really need to be shaped by other countries. This is a good evidence of, I don't want to say inability, but kind of not well-experienced diplomacy they have toward ASEAN, toward Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. So that is my concern. But the second concern is, I really don't think they really can do more than their own profits, right? But to have the real rule making, we have to go beyond our own profits, short-term profits. But the Biden administration focused too much on their own industrial policy, own superiority in technology, and on creation of high-paid job. So that is my concern lies for Biden administration. Military policy is fine, good commitment to the region, even though I have some concerns on the North Korean policy, but generally fine. Finally, Japan's response. As moderator shared in his beginning remarks, we are now trying to have more legal and institutional platform for economic security. This May, the Diet finally passed the Economic Security Promotion Act, and I somehow testified for that law in the Diet. But that is a good package. Of course, this is just a starter, but the 4 areas, critical resource, to secure critical resource, to protect our critical infrastructure, to have public-private partnership for advanced science and technology. This is very lengthy word, but the point is the government wants to spend more money to advance technology. And the fourth item is secret patent. In addition to that, the government just enacted the new law to protect the land. I mean, like Australia, like United States, and like some European countries, we finally introduced a new legal platform to know who owns the land nearby our military facility. This is also another aspect of our economic security. So in a nutshell, we now put a lot of political resources to economic security. But, economic security is a really need partnership from other countries. So Taiwan, of course, South Korea, ASEAN, and United States, Australia, New Zealand, yes. We really need a network. The moderator said friend shore. Friend shore is the one very important word. But not only friend shore, such a production network. We also need, many attempts to secure our economic security. So economic security is a really important concept, but quite important. That is a way to enhance our alliance network or partnership networks more beyond traditional security things. So I think 10 minutes passed, but of course I have many things to add, but I really want to enjoy our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor SAHASHI. We'll come back to you for additional comments. And I think from Taiwan or even from Indo-Pacific perspective, we are interested to learn more on Japan's reaction to the new global economic forum that is still unfolding. Japan, similar to Taiwan, have a huge business stake in China, for example. So this new economic order definitely will have implications, challenges, and opportunities as well. So in addition to this new Economic Security Promotion Act, what's the policy directions for the Japanese government collaborating with the US and other Indo-Pacific partners, including Taiwan at one hand, and also addressing the challenges facing a rising and more aggressive China? That's probably another dimension that we can come back for further discussion later. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Samir PURI from the Hybrid Warfare and Urban Security IISS-Asia, Singapore, to take the floor. Dr. PURI, please.
Thank you very much for the extremely kind invitation to address the Katagalan Forum. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity. I'm normally based at the IISS office in Singapore, and we recently completed our Shangri-La Dialogue event. I'm joining you from London, however. I'm just on my way back into Singapore. And just a very quick note about my professional background before I deliver my comments. Before I moved to Singapore, I was in the British Foreign Office, and I spent 1 year monitoring the onset of the war in Ukraine in 2014-15, seconded to an international diplomatic mission. So I have worked on Ukraine on the front lines, and of course now on Asia-Pacific security since I'm based in Singapore. And I'd like to draw from both of those experiences some overarching views about some of the impacts on global economic order arising from what I see to be one of the most important features of the international order, and that's the simultaneity of US-China rivalry and US-Russia rivalry. Clearly, it's a statement, I think, of the obvious that the US and its partners and close allies, including the United Kingdom, of course, are very much opposed to the war in Ukraine. They're trying to stop Russia from succeeding by doing everything but join the fight. We all know that the NATO nations are providing weaponry, they're providing intelligence support, they're providing diplomatic and moral support as well. And at the same time, there is a heightening of tensions between the Western nations and China as well. And although that relationship is not characterized by armed conflict happening somewhere in Asia, we know full well that that is not an impossible prospect in the future. So this simultaneity, as well as China and Russia's own tightening of relations in their partnership, President Xi and President Putin declared on the 4th of February, the now infamous Beijing Winter Olympics bilateral meeting. This simultaneity is decisively shaping international order because it is heightening a split of global economic order into autocratic and democratic camps. That's an important feature because one of the lessons that's emerging from the sanctions regime against Russia is that while some nations have been very quick to join this sanctions regime and to condemn Russia, others have not. I just want to go over some of those categories there. Quite clearly, the closest allies and partners to the US have joined the US in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I noted that Australia, Japan, Republic of Korea, and even Singapore, which normally keeps its head very much out of trouble, all in their own ways have condemned rhetorically Russia's imperial conquest of Ukraine. That's how I should describe it. Those are my words. But also have imposed their own sanctions. If you look at Australia's sanctions, for example, they run the gamut from everything from the expected coal and energy products all the way to luxury consumer goods. The EU, of course, is wrestling with the issue of how to sanction Russia. But what I really want to focus on in my comments, and this, I hope, is a lesson for those attending this forum and want to reflect on around the complexities of this, the other countries that are attempting to perhaps play both sides or to hedge their bets for a variety of domestic reasons, potentially also political, cultural reasons. And, I'm not reading out a list here to try to shame or embarrass any country. I think it's just a statement of fact that countries as diverse as India, Indonesia, and Turkey, from 3 different parts of the world, have not matched these sanctions, have not necessarily joined them, have not necessarily introduced their own. And we will, of course, know some of the reasons. They're very different reasons. India has this defense relationship with Russia. Indonesia is hosting the G20 and probably wants to retain its status as a neutral broker. And Turkey is mediating talks between Russia and Ukraine, but is also still, as far as I can tell, accepting large amounts of Russian tourists to come in, despite other nations banning flights of Russian airlines. So what we have, I think, are a series of emerging lessons that I want to summarize into 3 key points, which I hope will be of relevance and of use to those in the audience. The first key point is we cannot necessarily automatically assume that if the US was to impose a sort of a wartime sanctions regime against the People's Republic of China in the event of some kind of emergency or armed conflict contingency, that the whole world would follow immediately. There may be very diverse domestic reactions in some countries, and I think mapping and predicting those diverse reactions is actually a very important preparatory step that one can take in thinking about the security of smaller states in the Asia-Pacific. And I wonder the extent to some of the lessons from how sanctions have been responded to in relation to Russia can carry over to the US-China rivalry. Of course, the economies are very different. Sanctioning China is a completely different category of undertaking to sanctioning Russia. But nonetheless, I think we should be very mindful of the fact that there are many domestic economies, not only in Asia, that are very dependent upon trade with the People's Republic of China. The second point, and this is a predictive point, having worked on Ukraine and having lived in Ukraine for a very long time, I, of course, feel a considerable affinity and immense sympathy with Ukraine, not only because I have many former colleagues who are Ukrainian. When we were doing the ceasefire monitoring work, all of my translators were, of course, Ukrainian. They were citizens of the Donbass. And so, on the one hand, I do hope that Russia is punished. On the other hand, the sort of the human response in me hopes that fighting stops, as soon as it feasibly can, with a just kind of settlement emerging. But my question to the forum is, how long will the sanctions against Russia persist after the future termination of armed conflict in Ukraine? That moment could come by the end of this year, it could come in 2023, it could come in 2024. One would assume if the Putin regime survives in Moscow, that certainly the US, the UK, and the EU will not want to do business with that regime, given the nature of this conflict. But it is not a given that all countries around the world that have participated in sanctions would form a similar opinion, given that fighting may have ceased. So that's another thing I want to just bring up as a thought, is the durability of sanctions in the event of armed conflict, either pausing or terminating in a sort of seeming enduring way, but the regime responsible for that armed conflict remaining in power. And I'm going to sort of bring my comments to a close quite soon, but I think the third point that I want to raise is actually, because I'm currently sitting in London, I'm joining you, as I say, from the UK. I haven't quite got to Singapore yet. You'll know that the UK is selecting a new Prime Minister, and we just watched last night the final public debate between the two contenders, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, the current Foreign Secretary, and Rishi Sunak, current Chancellor. Something that Liz Truss, who was actually the favourite to win this contest, said about a global economic order in a time of war did strike a chord with me, actually. Liz Truss said that the war in Ukraine is a warning that we became overly dependent upon the Russian economy. Let's not make the same mistake with dependency on the economy of the People's Republic of China. I thought that was a very interesting statement, because she is, of course, pointing out that the dependencies on the imports of Russian energy products has really complicated the European response to punishing Russia for its invasion. There's an emergency meeting of the European Union just today, tonight in European time, looking at the fact that one of the Russian pipelines is reducing its production. And there is a possibility that since Europe was buying 40% of its gas from Russia, that there's going to be serious economic impacts across the European Union of punishing Russia for its invasion, but most seriously actually on Germany, because if the German economy is tipped into a recession, the whole European single market will stutter and suffer. So Putin, of course, knows these vulnerabilities. He's playing on these vulnerabilities. They're economic vulnerabilities. And I think I'll bring my comments to a close now, Chair, with just one sort of summing up comment, which is, you don't need me to tell you that economic warfare is now a fully-fledged component of coercive diplomacy, let alone an accompaniment of armed conflict. And whilst there's no concrete mapping of the way this is played out in Europe, where I'm sitting now, to the Asia-Pacific, where I'll be soon heading back to, we can certainly, I think, draw some really important lessons around how quickly countries decide to sanction an aggressor, an imperial aggressor who's engaged in a war of conquest, how hard it is to bring sort of global consensus. You will be able to bring global consensus in the G7. And our fellow panelist from Japan, I took your comments, I think, very seriously about Japan's excellent response to what's happening. But when you walk out to the G20, as we're going to see in November with the G20 summit in Indonesia, you start to see a much greater diversity of opinion. Sergei Lavrov was always very keen to point out that the world is more multipolar or polycentric, therefore less Western-dominated. And I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons Russia gambled on this awful invasion is because it felt that the world was less Western-dominated. Now, I'm going to end my comments now, but I just want to leave us with that thought, because there's nothing static in world affairs. And yes, we are leaving that era of undisputed US unipolarity. We are entering a different era. And I think some of our assumptions about Western leadership in response to international aggression, they always just need to be updated. It's been a great response against Russia in Ukraine, but we need to keep updating our sense of what that might look like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, when the global economy becomes even more diverse and balanced in terms of where wealth is coming from. And with that, I just want to reiterate my most sincere thanks, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir. You touch upon a very, very interesting and challenging topic, the scenario of economic sanction against a potential Chinese aggression against, for example, Taiwan or other countries in this region. China is much more deeply interconnected with the global economy. Put it differently, economic dependency on China by Taiwan, Japan, or even the United States are much higher than the Europeans' dependency on Russia's energy at this moment, right? For example, majority of the iPhones sold in the United States are still assembled in China. And if you look at the trade deficit the US is running in the last 3 years against China, you realize that it is an indication that simply the US importers couldn't find effective alternative sources of supply. So what they do is they continue to import from China, even though that means paying the tariffs. So that's probably a very, maybe we can come back on the effectiveness of a potential economic sanction against China. At this moment, if the current structure remain unchanged, I think the effectiveness of a potential sanction will be limited. And that's probably one of the more serious debates about how we're going to reshape and reduce this source of risks in the long run. But we can come back to that later. Thank you very much. Lastly, I would like to invite our last but not least speaker, Dr. Meredith LILLY, to share with us her views on the World Economic Order through a pre-recorded video link.
Thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the invitation to speak to you today and to the Prospect Foundation for hosting. My name is Meredith LILLY and I'm a professor at Carleton University in Canada. I regret not being able to be there with you in person given COVID restrictions, but I look forward to another opportunity to engage in future. It's now nearly a year and a half into the Biden administration and tensions between the US and China continue. Just a few months away from President Xi's attempt to secure an unprecedented third term, Russia's invasion into Ukraine has only heightened concerns about a new Cold War and an even more fractured global order. It's in this context that the US has launched its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has been interpreted by China as an attempt to lure regional countries away from its orbit and more firmly into the American sphere of influence. The 12 other countries handpicked by the US for engagement in its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework represent both high growth, advanced economies such as South Korea and Japan, alongside emerging markets such as Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. While these countries welcome greater engagement in the region, most don't want to be placed in the position of taking sides in the US-China rivalry. Regional countries seeking to advance their relationship with the United States via its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are also working hard to clarify their own goals for regional frameworks that are open to all countries, including China. Canada offers one example of a country that has experienced both successes and disappointments as it has sought to navigate this rivalry over the past 5 years. It's well known that the United States is our neighbor and closest ally. Overall, we enjoy strong bilateral relations, balanced trade, and a close security and defense relationship. Despite this, we also have our moments of disagreement, and we've been subject to the consequences of American exceptionalism. US administrations of both stripes, before and after the Trump administration, have on occasion used American unilateralism to disadvantage Canada's trade interests. Some of these continue today under the Biden administration, including protectionist measures under its Made in America policies. But despite these setbacks, Canada and the US are able to address these issues productively and simultaneously focus on areas of agreement and cooperation. These are the markers of a mature bilateral relationship. Meanwhile, Canada has just endured a very difficult period of tension with China over the illegal detention of 2 of our citizens, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. These arrests were made in retaliation for Canada's upholding of its extradition treaty with the United States when Canadian authorities arrested Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. For 2 years, our citizens remained detained in China, and our own domestic policy on files such as the use of Huawei 5G and our telecom networks were held hostage. At the same time, Canada also has trade and bilateral interests with China, and so we understand very clearly what it is to be placed uncomfortably in the middle of the US-China rivalry. I thought today it would be useful to use a concrete example to highlight the ways in which I think we can move forward with difficult files despite these tensions. Over the next few minutes, I will focus on the enlargement of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I will draw from several recent publications that are published with Canadian think tanks and a forthcoming chapter with co-author Amelie Lee. And I'll argue that Canada and other CPTPP countries can work together to address enlargement in a way that demonstrates how middle powers can work constructively to apply international rules in a manner that allows us to make progress without allowing US-China rivalry to define the future of this trade agreement. And by applying a rules-based process, all prospective applicants, including Taiwan, can be considered based on the merits of their economic and trade policies and the potential benefits these can bring to the trade agreement. CPTPP is an 11-country agreement that was designed with a flexible structure open to any new members who sought to reach the agreement's high standards and ambition. While the US's withdrawal was regarded as a major blow to the agreement at the time, in the face of US-China rivalry, the absence of both countries currently serves as an opportunity to address the trade interests of others without the domination of either major power. And as the second largest economy in the CPTPP, Canada wields considerable influence over welcoming new members. Yet even within the CPTPP, it's important to know that Canada and Mexico are outliers with respect to the relative importance of trade with the United States versus China. As you can see from this figure, Canada and Mexico rely on trade with the United States for over 60% of our bilateral trade, but on China for only 10%. This contrasts to other CPTPP members who are much more reliant on trade with China than the US. And I raise this because this difference is important to understand in the way both Canada as well as CPTPP members are likely to approach the accession negotiations with respect to China. While Canada and Mexico are very sensitive to the relationship between CPTPP and USMCA, most other CPTPP countries are more sensitive to the relationship of the agreement to their trade with China. Before considering the entry of new applicants to the agreement, we must be concerned about the ratification process by existing members. 3 of 11 have not yet ratified, and it's not clear that they will. This means those countries don't benefit from the agreement and can't participate in the process for accession until they ratify. And as many are aware, there's only one country currently actively negotiating to enter the CPTPP, and that's the United Kingdom. 4 others have now formally applied: Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Ecuador. From a GDP rankings perspective, most new aspirants to the agreement would offer strong value to the agreement. Only Ecuador is a very small economy relative to current members, and Taiwan's economy is bigger than more than half of current members. In addition, other countries who may consider joining in the future, such as Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, also represent major and important economies. Though many are concerned about how to manage both Taiwan and China's applications, this really should be a clear process. As a full WTO member, Taiwan's legal status is not in question. Thus, all new applicants could be considered for membership. And in adjudicating these applications, Canada should work with other members to focus on the agreement's high standards and ambition and welcome any countries who can demonstrate these through reforms implemented prior to accession. While it's likely that Taiwan and South Korea could do so almost immediately, at present China would need to undertake considerable structural reforms to open its economy before it could be permitted to accede. And so in this way, the agreement process offers an example of the manner in which members can work constructively to apply rules, standards, and trade policy evidence to evaluate potential entrants while downplaying expectations for exceptional treatment by powerful countries. Nevertheless, both China and the United States can be expected to seek exceptional treatment. China for its non-adherence to market-based reforms and its expectation that Taiwan's application should be rejected. Meanwhile, although the United States does not intend to join the agreement, it still expects to influence accession deliberations. Using its existing trade relationships with member economies, I expect the US to use its IPEF negotiations and other forms of leverage to ensure its goals for CPTPP are considered. And one of those goals will be the rejection of China. With Canada and Mexico, for example, USMCA's non-market economy clause will certainly be invoked if necessary. These expectations by both the US and China underscore the reason that it's important to allow the agreement's high standards and ambition to guide consideration of new members. Until very recently, many countries have studiously sought to avoid provoking China by ignoring its threats to Taiwan. Ukraine's experience with Russia demonstrates the dangers of such timidity. The CPTPP accession process is in danger of suffering from similar avoidance strategies with respect to China. If Ukraine's situation offers any lessons to the CPTPP community, the desire to avoid difficult decisions through delays does not make them disappear, and the failure to shield a vulnerable neighbor can have dire consequences for all. Members have an opportunity to lead this effort to set aside politically motivated challenges to Taiwan's accession and consider its case on trade and economic grounds. Finally, even between trade partners with no major geopolitical challenges or disputes, the negotiation, ratification, and implementation of agreements takes time and can become subject to domestic political influence. For example, in the case of Canada's trade agreement with Europe, it has been close to a decade since negotiations concluded, and it has been 5 years since the agreement was implemented. But despite this, 11 EU members still have not ratified the agreement. It's my view that much of this pertains to special interest lobbies in member states. When delays such as this can occur between close friends and allies, such as Canada and the European Union, this also threatens the rules-based order. How do we negotiate difficult files with major powers such as China and the US when we see no urgency around making progress on positive and non-controversial files with friends? My bottom line message today is that all countries need to pay attention to the US-China rivalry, and we must also be aware of the respective interests of other countries in their interactions with superpowers and other multilateral fora. Yet it's important for other states that are committed to the rules-based order to keep moving forward and not to allow the rivalry to either dominate or paralyze progress on plurilateral and multilateral initiatives. Thanks for your time. And again, I hope to join you in person in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lilly. Well, she's from a very different time zone. It's actually, if I understand correctly, 4 a.m. in the morning at Carleton University, so she simply couldn't join us physically, but we are grateful for her pre-recorded video message. She raised a very interesting and maybe contentious topic, that is China's application to the CPTPP. China is definitely made the major trading partner for most CPTPP members, that's for sure, economically. But China is also a country that demonstrates it has no intention to follow the rules and disciplines. For example, Chinese economic sanctions against Australia took place in 2020 against a background that there is an effective Australia-China FTA. And similarly, China's sanction against South Korea also took place against the background that there is an effective China-South Korea FTA. So, well, I can continue to name the list. And also, well, of course, you know well that Taiwan is also one member of the victims club against Chinese corrosive economic action. So the reason why China is applying for CPTPP and its ability or intention to follow the disciplines are actually in a very big question. There's a big question mark. But at the same time, even though I think Taiwan is close to ready, it's a kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of our CPTPP accession. It appears that many countries have reservations to pick the fruit, to start the negotiation with Taiwan, and that's probably the geopolitics that is playing at the background. And maybe that's something we can all share, have further elaboration on for these panelists. for this panel. But before I return to our panelists for their further elaborations or clarification, or maybe additional comments on these little questions I raised along the course, I would like to invite questions from the floor to our three panelists that are with us today on the topic of economic security, new economic order, countries' reaction to this new phenomenon or new paradigms, or individual countries' positions in light of all this latest development. So I would like to invite, the floor is open, and I would like to invite there. Okay, I saw two questions here. Okay. Okay, we have three questions. So, sorry, okay, you please take the floor.
Hi.
And I'll come back to you later.
Yeah. I'm Vincent Liu. I come from Foreign Ministry, and our department covers the issues of Russia and the Ukraine. As far as my office duty is concerned, I'm more interested in the sanction against Russia and its implication to the global economic order. So to put my question very simply, I want to seek the panelists' opinion whether the sanctions against Russia really work, because we now see President Biden went to Middle East to seek for some partnership in alleviating the oil shortage problem. But in the meantime, we saw that Vladimir Putin met with his Iranian counterpart, and Putin's foreign minister also visits Africa, tries to explain the food crisis problem and also seek some understanding. So the question is, if we look back the sanction history against certain countries, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and even Iran, they don't give in easily. And we also witnessing that before Russia gives in, the whole world is already pay the price of the economic sanction. So when the Russian-Ukraine war enter a prolonged stalemate, do we optimistically look at the validity of economic sanction against Russia? And I would like to seek your opinion. Thank you.
I think that's a question for all panelists for a general reaction to that, but we'll come back to later. Sir, you may have the floor. Thank you. Can we have another mic? We need a mic because the panel can't hear us unless we are on a mic.
Thank you. My question is to our New Zealand friend, and in the context of economic dependency, I wonder, Mr. FINNY, if you cared to comment on New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern's comments last week that it was wrong to characterise Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine as democracy versus autocracy, and that it would be wrong to force specific nations to choose between China and the West.
Thank you. That's actually, Charles, a very directed to you question. We'll come back to you after I collect the last question from the floor. Okay. The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. My name is Dmitro Burtsev, a visiting scholar from Ukraine in Academia Sinica, the school of the Institute of European and American Studies. Well, if we compare a war to disease, it's easier to prevent disease than to cure it, right? We can see already inflammation in Ukraine, heavy inflammation in Ukraine, and we can predict the second inflammation in Taiwan. So, do any gentlemen know which magical pill should we take to prevent, measures to prevent conflict from inflammation? Or does this bill exist or no? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with the first question, a general question on the effectiveness of the economic sanction against Russia. Anyone would like to take the floor first? Samir, please. Sorry, you have to, can you check to turn on the mic? We can't hear you here. Yeah, it works now.
I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, well, it's working now.
Just to say thank you for a perceptive range of questions. And a gentleman from the Foreign Ministry who asked about the effectiveness of sanctions. So I think I've got quite a direct answer. In relation to Russia, the sanctions that was the first hopes. And President Zelensky of Ukraine, amongst other people, asked the Americans for preemptive sanctions. Mean that Russia's military became apparent and was exposed by Western intelligence agencies that American and Western sanctions would have begun immediately. Now, there's a lesson here which I have to say I think Biden made the right decision, because imagine if you had preemptively sanctioned Russia, Russia would have claimed victimhood and probably would have invaded quicker. Based on what we know, I don't think that preemptive sanctions would have stopped Russia. That's my looking back at what happened in January and February. The second point to my answer is that so far sanctions have not compelled Russia to stop invasion. Clearly, it's made Russia's economy suffer, and it's made Russia's war effort all the more difficult. But as the gentleman from the Foreign Ministry in his question posited at the end, the real issue is in the context of a possible stalemate. There'll be Ukrainian counteroffensives. Maybe they will succeed. We don't know. War is always a gamble. But in the event that they don't, and Ukraine sadly remains territorially divided between a section occupied by Russia, still occupied by the Ukraine, that have a really important, I think, consideration to make about how long sanctions will be maintained against Russia, and I think how many countries will maintain those sanctions in the long run, and whether that will wear Russia down over the long run. That's probably my answer.
Dr. Puri, would you like to briefly touch upon the third question on whether there is a magic pill for Ukraine as well?
Yes, this is a question asked by our friend from Ukraine in the audience, and I think it's a great question. I'm really worried, personally, because the world experiencing transition. What I describe is that for my entire life, the USA has been the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, to use an analogy from boxing. Today, I feel that the USA is the disputed heavyweight champion of the world. It's still the most powerful country by a long stretch, especially in military terms, but there is challenge. And it's not only China. You can see in the behavior of countries clearly like Russia, but also Turkey as well, that there is more of a willingness to take risks, to move in contention of what America has said accord to the rules-based international order. And I think the other thing that we do is to maintain dialogue. The tendency to break away from dialogue, no matter how difficult dialogue with the People's Republic of China, I think there's still a real importance to keep talking to Beijing. If you're sitting in capitals like Washington, Brussels, and London, there's a real importance to keep talking to Beijing. Otherwise, you end up completely isolated, and then plots and plans will happen without any ability to engage the policy in that capital. And I think there's the possibility, the risk of a loss of influence, just by sitting back and expecting that the world being divided, the right camp is good enough. Just if I'm on this question. I also agree that autocracy versus democracy is not a very compelling categorization for many countries around the world. Even a country like Singapore has an issue with it being that black and white in its categorization. And I think we also need to think more pragmatically about different regions of the world rather than just impose a sort of as how the world should be. We have to look at how the world actually is. Thank you.
Thank you. And Charles, let's start with the question directly to you on New Zealand's position.
That's was a quote from a speech our Prime Minister gave recently at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia. And a number of us were scratching our heads about it here. I interpret the question and comment being an attempt to reach out to China to say that conflict between China and the democracies in this region is not inevitable, and that we're prepared to keep talking and dialoguing. But it's still something that we're debating. In fact, today I had a journalist in my office and we were talking about this topic for a couple of hours and didn't reach a final conclusion. Look, maybe could I just answer a couple of other of the questions that sort of came my way in terms of, and came others' ways too. In terms of how New Zealand is responding to all this, obviously we're talking as part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but we've gone ahead and negotiated new trade agreements, new free trade agreements with the UK and most recently the EU. And there's a very active debate in New Zealand about the extent to which some of our companies are dependent upon China as a market. In the most extreme cases, it's pretty much all our lobster exports going to China, nowhere else. But a number of our major companies are exporting 30, 40, 50% of their products to China. And the government can't tell those companies not to do it. But there's a very active debate about whether this is wise, again, without conclusion. And most significantly, I think, is we've changed our law New Zealand is a small country. We're hugely dependent upon an effective rules-based international order. We've been very reluctant to take sanctions without the Security Council telling us we can. But we've changed our law. We now can impose sanctions unilaterally, and we've done so with great intent with regard to Russia. I don't think our sanctions are going to make Mr. Putin change his policies, but they're part of a global effort, and I think are going to have an impact, particularly on some of his wealthy friends who are personally sanctioned.
Thank you. And lastly, very briefly, Sakashi-san, would you like to respond to the three questions?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think I almost agree with my previous speaker said. The real issue for sanctions against Russia is, how long we can keep the unity, even though we have a lot of loopholes and that does not work really well to deter Russia's further aggression to Ukraine. And European states has been not so well prepared for the real long sanctions, which could take place, in coming years. I mean, they are ill prepared for, these massive sanctions against Russia. So we have to admit, and this should be a big lesson for us, for Taiwan and for Japan and for East Asia. We really have to prepare ourselves for the long term, for the long years, sanctions against China if something happened. And this is my take from the lessons from Russia's sanctions case. And I don't have any magic to change the course of Russia's aggression too. But what we really have to do is to keep our coalition and to support Ukraine, not only economically, but also militarily, as long as possible, of course, and also diplomatically. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel.
Thank you very much. Well, finally, my apologies. Not serving a good moderator. We are already over time. But please join me to thank our three panelists with us today for their insightful and very interesting discussion. Hopefully, next year we'll continue the dialogue on economic security and solutions to address those challenges. Thank you very much for joining us. This panel is adjourned. Thank you.
All right, thanks to Senior Deputy Director Lee for moderating this panel.